What we're looking at are shrimp that were harvested in the Gulf of Mexico, in the area that was impacted by the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster now over 2 years ago. And here is a whole parcel of shrimp that were collected within this week in November. So this is what the fishermen's catches look like now in the Gulf. What you notice is this blackened area through here. All this black is oil. And what I'm thinking of is mutated wildlife here. No eyes, no eye sockets, these other deformities. I believe this was because of the dispersant. Extraordinary spraying of just mass quantities of dispersant at the surface, at the subsurface, day after day for months. Now, the significance of this is that if you were buying shrimp in a market, mostly they come with just the tails, right? So you'd just be getting this portion on back. You wouldn't be seeing the gut. You wouldn't be seeing the tumors. You wouldn't be seeing the ones with missing eyes. You would think you're eating a healthy shrimp. But would it really pass FDA inspection if, you could see the head as well? So the habitat where they live is still oiled. And the shrimp, as indicators of this ecosystem, are picking this up and processing it, as is everything in the ecosystem, in the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem that's coming into contact with this. The turtles, the shrimp, the fish, the birds, the dolphins, the porpoise, the whales, everything is still being exposed to BP oil plus the toxic dispersants.
On April 20th, an explosion ripped through BP Deepwater Horizon drilling rig, about 40 miles off the coast of Louisiana. Already, this oil spill is the worst environmental disaster America has ever faced. And unlike an earthquake or a hurricane, it's not a single event that does its damage in a matter of minutes or days. The millions of gallons of oil that have spilled into the Gulf of Mexico are more like an epidemic, one that we will be fighting for months and even years. But we have to recognize that despite our best efforts, oil has already caused damage to our coastline and its wildlife. And sadly, no matter how effective our response is, there will be more oil and more damage before this siege is done. The agency in charge of regulating drilling and issuing permits, known as the Minerals Management Service. Over the last decade, this agency has become emblematic of a failed philosophy that views all regulation with hostility. A philosophy that says corporations should be allowed to play by their own rules and police themselves. At this agency, industry insiders were put in charge of industry oversight. Oil companies showered regulators with gifts and favors and were essentially allowed to conduct their own safety inspections and write their own regulations. And when Ken Salazar became my Secretary of the Interior, one of his very first acts was to clean up the worst of the corruption at this agency. But it's now clear that the problem there ran much deeper, and the pace of reform was just too slow. And so Secretary Salazar and I are bringing in new leadership at the agency. After all, oil is a finite resource. We consume more than 20% of the world's oil, but have less than 2% of the world's oil reserves. And that's part of the reason oil companies are drilling a mile beneath the surface of the ocean, because we're running out of places to drill on land and in shallow water. For decades, we have known the days of cheap and easily accessible oil were numbered. For decades, we've talked and talked about the need to end America's century-long addiction to fossil fuels. And for decades, we have failed to act with the sense of urgency that this challenge requires. Time and again, the path forward has been blocked, not only by oil industry lobbyists, but also by a lack of political courage and candor. The consequences of our inaction are now in plain sight. Each day, we send nearly $1 billion of our wealth to foreign countries for their oil. And today, as we look to the Gulf, we see an entire way of life being threatened by a menacing cloud of black crude. We cannot consign our children to this future. The tragedy unfolding on our coast is the most painful and powerful reminder yet that the time to embrace a clean energy future is now. Now is the moment for this generation to embark on a national mission to unleash America's innovation and seize control of our own destiny. This is not some distant vision for America. The transition away from fossil fuels is going to take some time. But over the last year and a half, we've already taken unprecedented action to jumpstart the clean energy industry. The oil spill is not the last crisis America will face. This nation has known hard times before, and we will surely know them again. What sees us through, what has always seen us through, is our strength, our resilience, and our unyielding faith that something better awaits us if we summon the courage to reach for it. Tonight, we pray for that courage.
So in addition to the tar balls and the strings, there's also tar mats offshore, and in one case there was one that was estimated to be as big as the state of Rhode Island. The issue is that there were a number of technologies that could have evaluated and plotted on maps these subsurface layers that are the crude oil offshore. And they actually did some test runs for BP, and then BP dismissed them. As of today, the crude oil in the tar balls and the mats and the strings still wash on shore every single day. And when we have a really bad weather front, large quantities are washed on shore. So the dispersant COREXIT was used to disperse the crude that, one, came to the surface in the Gulf as a slick, and it was applied primarily by airplane. And then COREXIT was also put right at the wellhead, and it was supposed to be mixing with the crude as it flowed out of the wellhead on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. I kept getting phone calls the whole time the well was flowing from workers on other rigs that they were being sprayed with COREXIT and that they were being made very sick. So I would call the appropriate agencies, and they would call me back and say, we don't spray where there are people, we don't spray where there are mammals, so no one is supposed to be being sprayed. The workers would go out and identify large deposits in the marshes, and then they will pull back, and then the next time they went in a few days, it was all gone. And the only way it could be all gone was if it dispersed and if it had been sprayed with the dispersant. So there were a huge number of people in the coastal areas that were made very, very sick from the dispersant and the crude oil. And when the crude was a slick on the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, the strong winds and the high waves changed it into an aerosol, sort of like a pump hairspray, and it blew onshore as far inland as 100 miles. So all the people in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and the panhandle of Florida were being impacted by this aerosol that was blowing onshore. Respiratory problems, coughing, headache, and the agencies were denying that that was happening. And I was receiving just huge quantities of phone calls from these people. And then I'd start receiving them from parents who had like a newborn that was a preemie, and they were going like, and ever since we brought the baby home, the baby's been real sick, we've been sick. You know, I said, okay, I can tell you what the situation is. You've got to make a decision whether or not you move out of the area or you continue to live in the area. So there were all these health impacts being documented over and over and over again, and yet the agencies just did not care to have to address that.